I gave the greedy heirs exactly what they wanted, and that was the moment everything began to fall apart for them. The lawyer's voice was steady at first, calm in that practiced way that comes from years of reading documents that change people's lives, but I could see the exact second his eyes reached that final sentence because his tone shifted, just slightly, like a man stepping onto a floor he didn't realize was hollow. Daniel didn't notice it right away. My son was leaning back in his chair, one arm draped over the leather armrest like he already owned the room, like the outcome had been decided long before we ever sat down. Ashley, sitting beside him, had that small, controlled smile she always wore when she thought she was winning. It was never wide, never obvious, just enough to let you know she believed herself to be the smartest person in the room. I had seen that smile for years. I had learned to recognize what it meant. Victory, in her mind, had already been secured. I folded my hands in my lap and said nothing. The office was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the faint rustle of paper as Mr. Collins continued reading. The sunlight coming through the tall windows fell across the polished desk, catching the edge of the documents, illuminating the signatures that Daniel had been so eager to see. I could still remember how quickly he had agreed when Ashley suggested we simplify things. That was the word she used. Simplify. As if a lifetime of work, of building something from nothing, could be reduced to a neat stack of paper and a few signatures at the bottom. As if I were something that needed to be managed, organized, filed away. 48 hours earlier, I had been sitting alone in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I had cooked thousands of meals, where I had stood beside my husband, Edward, planning a life we both believed would hold our family together. The house had felt different then. Not empty, not exactly. Just quieter in a way that made every sound seem too loud. The ticking clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant echo of footsteps upstairs that no longer came looking for me. Daniel had stopped asking me how I was doing months ago. At first I told myself he was busy. Work, responsibilities, life. That's what we always tell ourselves when the people we love start to drift away. We make excuses for them because the truth feels too heavy to hold. But then there were the smaller things. The way Ashley would answer questions directed at him. The way decisions about the house were made without ever including me. The way my belongings slowly began to move, one drawer at a time, as if I were being gently erased from a place I had once defined. I remember standing in the hallway one evening, listening without meaning to, as their voices carried from the living room. Once she signs, everything is ours, Ashley said, her tone low but certain. There was no hesitation in her voice. No doubt. Just certainty. Daniel didn't argue. That was the part that stayed with me. He didn't defend me. He didn't question her. He just agreed. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly, like a door closing somewhere deep inside a house you thought you knew. I didn't confront them. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. Instead, I made a decision. The next morning, I called Mr. Collins and asked for a private meeting. I didn't tell Daniel. I didn't tell Ashley. I simply drove downtown, parked my car in the same spot Edward used to favor, and walked into that office with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I want to make a small change, I told him. He asked me if I was sure. I said yes. Just one sentence. That's all it took. One sentence that would sit quietly at the end of a document they believed they already understood. One sentence that would turn certainty into something else entirely. When I returned home, I was the same person they expected me to be. Quiet. Agreeable. Easy to guide. When Ashley placed the documents in front of me, I signed them without hesitation. I even smiled, just enough to reassure her that everything was going according to plan. And now, sitting in that office again, watching the lawyer read the very words they had been so eager to hear, I could see the moment approaching like a slow-moving storm. Mr. Collins cleared his throat. His eyes flicked up from the page, briefly meeting mine, and in that instant he understood. Not everything, but enough. He looked back down and continued. Daniel leaned forward slightly, sensing the shift, but not yet understanding it. Ashley's fingers tightened around the edge of her chair, her smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. And then the sentence was read. The room didn't explode. There was no shouting, no dramatic outburst. Just silence. Heavy, unmistakable silence. The kind that settles into your bones and refuses to move. I sat there, perfectly still, my hands folded, my expression unchanged. Because I had already given them exactly what they wanted. They just hadn't realized what it would cost them. Daniel was the first to speak. But the confidence that had filled his voice just moments ago was gone, replaced by something thinner, uncertain, like a man trying to find his footing on unfamiliar ground. He leaned forward, his brow tightening as he looked at Mr. Collins, and then back at the document, as if the words might rearrange themselves if he stared long enough. "What does that mean?" he asked, and I noticed he did not say it with authority. He said it like a question he was not sure he wanted answered. Ashley did not speak at all, not at first, her hand still resting on the arm of her chair, fingers slightly curled, the same hand that had so confidently guided every decision in our household for the past 3 years. But now it was still, completely still, as if even she understood that movement might break whatever fragile control she thought she still had. Mr. Collins adjusted his glasses, a small, habitual gesture, but this time it carried weight, the kind that comes when a professional realizes the room has shifted from routine to something far more complicated. "It means," he said slowly, carefully choosing each word, "that the transfer of all assets is conditional upon continued care, residence rights, and non-interference with Mrs. Whitmore's autonomy. Any violation of these conditions results in immediate revocation of inheritance rights and full reversion of assets." The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before it. It was not confusion, not entirely. It was realization, slow and uncomfortable, settling in piece by piece. Daniel's eyes moved from the lawyer to me, searching, trying to understand something he had not anticipated, something he had not prepared for. I met his gaze without expression, without anger, without softness, just steady, and that seemed to unsettle him more than anything else could have. "Mom," he said, and there was something unfamiliar in his voice, something that had not been there in a long time. Hesitation. "We talked about this. We agreed that this was for the best." I tilted my head slightly, just enough to acknowledge that I had heard him. "We did," I said, my voice calm. "Even. And I gave you exactly what you asked for." Ashley finally moved then, her composure cracking just enough to reveal the calculation underneath. "This is not what we discussed," she said, her tone controlled but sharper now, the edges of it cutting through the quiet room. "There were no conditions." I looked at her, really looked at her, the way I had not allowed myself to for years, the way one does when they are no longer trying to preserve an illusion. "There were always conditions," I replied. "You just never thought they would apply to you." She opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came out, just a brief flicker of something behind her eyes, something close to panic. Daniel shifted in his seat, running a hand through his hair, a gesture he had carried with him since he was a boy whenever things did not go the way he expected. "This is not fair," he said, and the words hung in the air, thin and hollow. I almost smiled, not because it was amusing, but because of how familiar it sounded, how many times I had heard variations of that phrase over the years, usually directed at me, usually used to justify something that was anything but fair. "No," I said quietly. "It is not." Mr. Collins cleared his throat again, glancing between us as if measuring whether to continue. "There is an additional clause," he said, and now both Daniel and Ashley looked at him, their attention snapping back to the document as if it might still offer them something, anything, to hold on to. Any documented attempt to remove Mrs. Whitmore from her residence, limit her access to her own property, or coerce her into decisions regarding asset management will be considered a direct breach. He paused, just briefly, and then finished, and will trigger immediate enforcement. Ashley's composure broke then, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a subtle tightening of her jaw, a quick inhale that she could not quite control. "That is absurd," she said, but there was no conviction in it, just resistance. Daniel turned to her, confusion now overtaking whatever certainty he had been holding on to. "Did you know about this?" he asked, and for the first time since we had sat down, Ashley did not have an immediate answer. That was the moment I knew the balance had fully shifted, not because of the words on the page, but because of the silence between them, the space where trust had once been. I stood slowly, smoothing my hands over the fabric of my coat, a simple, familiar gesture, the kind I had done 1,000 times before leaving a room. But this time it felt different, deliberate, final. Daniel looked up at me, his expression searching, uncertain. "Where are you going?" he asked, and I met his eyes one last time. "Home," I said, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw the realization begin to settle in, not just about the document, not just about the conditions, but about something much larger, something he had not considered until it was too late, that the home he thought he was about to claim had never stopped being mine, and now, it never would be his. The drive home felt longer than usual. Even though the route had not changed in over 20 years, every stoplight seemed to last a little longer, every turn felt heavier, as if the weight of what had just happened had settled into the space around me. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, my posture the same as it had always been, upright, composed, controlled. Because control was something I had learned to hold on to even when everything else shifted. When I pulled into the driveway, the house stood exactly as it always had, quiet, dignified, untouched by the conversation that had just altered everything inside it. I sat there for a moment before turning off the engine, listening to the ticking sound as it cooled, letting the silence settle, not as an emptiness this time, but as something solid, something I could stand on. When I stepped inside, the familiar scent of polished wood and faint lavender greeted me, subtle, grounding, unchanged. I closed the door behind me with a gentle click and walked through the hallway, my footsteps soft against the hardwood floor, each room exactly as I had left it that morning. The living room still arranged with the same careful symmetry, the kitchen counters clean, the sunlight stretching across the table where I had once sat alone. I moved slowly, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to feel it, the space, the ownership, the quiet certainty that this was still mine, completely mine. I reached the window and looked out at the garden. The one Edward and I had planted together years ago. The roses were beginning to bloom, their color deep and steady, unaffected by anything beyond their roots. I thought about the years that had passed since he was gone, the gradual shift in the house, the way voices had changed, the way presence had turned into distance. I had noticed it long before I admitted it, the small adjustments, the quiet exclusions, the way Ashley had slowly positioned herself at the center of decisions that were never hers to make. At first it had been subtle, suggestions framed as concern, offers to help that slowly became control. She would rearrange things in the kitchen without asking, change appointments, answer questions directed at me as if my voice were no longer necessary. And Daniel, he had allowed it, not all at once, not deliberately, but gradually, like someone stepping back inch by inch until they were no longer part of the frame at all. I had watched it happen with a kind of quiet disbelief, telling myself that families change, that dynamics shift, that I needed to be understanding. But understanding has a way of becoming silence if you let it go on too long. I walked upstairs and paused outside the master bedroom. The door slightly open, just as I had left it. Inside, everything was still, the bed neatly made, Edward's photograph resting on the nightstand, his expression calm, steady, the same expression he had carried through every challenge we had ever faced together. I stepped inside and sat on the edge of the bed, my hands resting lightly in my lap, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to think clearly about everything that had led to this moment, not with regret, not with sadness, but with clarity. I had not acted out of anger, I had not changed the will to punish them. I had simply corrected something that had been allowed to drift too far from what it was meant to be. A boundary, clearly defined, unmistakable, and now it was in place. Downstairs, I heard the faint sound of a car pulling into the driveway, the engine cutting off, a door closing a little too firmly, footsteps approaching, faster than usual, less measured. I did not move, I did not rush. I simply remained where I was, listening as the front door opened, as voices entered the house, lower at first, tense, controlled, and then sharper, the kind of voices that come when control begins to slip. "She planned this," Ashley said, her tone tight, restrained but no longer smooth. "She knew exactly what she was doing." Daniel responded, his voice uncertain, caught between frustration and something else he had not yet named. "It is just a clause," he said, but the lack of conviction in his voice made the words feel hollow. "We can figure it out." There was a pause, the kind that stretches just long enough to reveal doubt. "No," Ashley said, and this time there was no softness at all. "We cannot just ignore it. It changes everything." I stood then, smoothing my hands over my coat once more, the same calm gesture, and walked toward the door, my steps unhurried, deliberate. When I reached the top of the stairs, I could see them below, standing in the entryway. Their posture different now, no longer relaxed, no longer confident. They looked up at the same moment, and for a second, no one spoke. The silence was not empty this time. It was full, heavy with everything that had not been said over the past few years. I met their eyes without hesitation, without emotion, just steady. And in that stillness, something shifted again, not in the documents, not in the legal terms, but in the space between us, the understanding that whatever they had believed about control, about ownership, about me, had been incomplete, and now, finally, it was clear. I stood at the top of the staircase for a moment longer than necessary, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted them to feel it, the distance that had quietly formed over time, the same distance they had created without ever acknowledging it, and now it stood between us like something solid, something neither of them quite knew how to cross. Daniel shifted first, his weight moving from one foot to the other in that familiar, restless way, his eyes searching my face, as if he were trying to find the version of me he remembered, the one who would smooth things over, who would explain, who would make it easier for him to understand. But that version of me had been shaped by years of believing that patience would be returned with respect, and now that belief had been replaced with something quieter, something firmer. "Mom," he said again, softer this time, and I could hear the effort in it, the attempt to reach for something that had already slipped away. I began to walk down the stairs slowly, my hand resting lightly on the railing, each step measured, controlled, not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate. Ashley watched me the entire time, her eyes sharper now, no longer softened by that practiced smile. She was calculating again, but this time the calculation was different. It was not about control, it was about recovery, about finding a way to regain ground that had been unexpectedly taken from her. "We need to talk about what just happened," she said as I reached the bottom step, her voice steady. But there was an edge beneath it, something that had not been there before. I stopped a few feet away from them, leaving just enough space to keep the distance clear. "We already did," I replied, my tone even, calm, the same tone I had used when explaining things to Daniel when he was a child. Only now there was no instruction in it, only finality. Ashley inhaled slowly, her posture straightening as if she were preparing to reassert herself. "That clause changes the entire agreement," she said, choosing her words carefully. "It was not part of the understanding." I looked at her, steady, unblinking. "It was always part of mine," I said, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the realization that there had been more than one understanding all along. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, his gaze dropping briefly to the floor before lifting again. "We were trying to make things easier for you," he said, and there it was again, that familiar justification, the one that sounds reasonable on the surface, but carries something else underneath it, something that erases more than it supports. I let a small pause settle before responding, not to create tension, but to let the weight of his words exist long enough to be seen clearly. "Easier," I repeated, not as a question, but as an observation. "You mean simpler," I added. "Simpler for you." Ashley's jaw tightened slightly. "That is not fair," she said, the words quick, almost automatic, and for a moment I saw the same expression she had worn in the lawyer's office, that brief flicker of resistance when control begins to slip. "No," I said quietly. "It is not." And again, the words hung there, not sharp, not raised, just undeniable. Daniel looked between us, his confusion deepening, as if he were beginning to realize that the situation was no longer something that could be resolved with a few reassurances or a quick adjustment. "So what happens now?" he asked, and this time, his voice was different, less certain, more cautious. I held his gaze for a moment, long enough for him to understand that the answer was not going to be what he expected. "Now," I said, "nothing changes." Ashley let out a small, incredulous breath. "Everything is changed," she countered, and there was a sharpness in it now, frustration breaking through the control she had been trying to maintain. I shook my head slightly. "No," I said. "Everything is exactly as it should have been." I stepped past them then, moving into the living room, not to avoid the conversation, but to reposition it, to shift the space from confrontation to something else, something more grounded. They followed, of course, their footsteps a half-beat behind mine. Uncertain now, less synchronized than they had been before, I paused near the window, the same one that looked out onto the garden, the late afternoon light stretching across the floor, steady, unchanged. You wanted the house, I said, turning slightly to face them. You wanted the assets, the control, the ability to decide what happens next. I let a brief pause settle, not for effect, but because the truth often needs space to be heard. And I gave you that. I continued. Every bit of it. Daniel frowned slightly, the confusion still present. Then why does it feel like we are losing something? He asked, and for the first time, there was no defensiveness in his voice, only uncertainty. I looked at him, really looked at him, the way I had when he was younger, before things became complicated, before influence and distance and silence had reshaped everything. Because, I said, my voice steady, calm, you never understood what you were asking for. Ashley did not respond this time, and that silence, that absence of immediate correction or control, said more than anything she could have added. The room settled again, quiet, but not the same quiet as before. This was different, heavier, more aware, and as I stood there, watching them, I knew that whatever came next would not be decided by assumptions or quiet agreements made without me. It would be decided by something far simpler, something that had been missing for a long time, clarity. The word lingered in the air longer than either of them expected, not because it was loud, but because it was precise. Clarity has a way of settling into a room without asking permission, and once it is there, it does not leave easily. Daniel looked down again, his shoulders shifting slightly, as if the weight of something unspoken had finally found its place. Ashley, however, remained still, her posture straight, her expression carefully composed. But I could see it now, the subtle tightening around her eyes, the slight delay before she spoke. The calculations were still there, but they were no longer ahead of the moment. They were catching up. We can adjust, she said finally, her voice controlled, measured. There is no need to make this more complicated than it has to be. I turned my attention to her fully, not dismissive, not confrontational, just present. It is not complicated, I replied. It is simply defined now. She held my gaze, searching for something, perhaps a weakness, perhaps an opening. But there was nothing defined, because I was no longer trying to negotiate a position that had already been settled. Daniel exhaled slowly, running his hand along his jaw as if trying to ground himself. So what exactly are we supposed to do? He asked, and this time there was something different in his tone, not resistance, not confidence, but uncertainty, genuine uncertainty. I let a brief silence settle before answering, not to create tension, but to allow the question to fully exist. You live here, I said, my voice even, steady. You respect the house, you respect the terms, and you respect me. Ashley's expression shifted, just slightly, a flicker of disbelief passing through before she masked it again. We have always respected you, she said quickly, and the speed of her response gave it away more than the words themselves. I tilted my head just enough to acknowledge the statement. No, I said calmly. You have managed me. The distinction landed quietly, but it did not need to be loud to be understood. Daniel looked at Ashley then, a brief glance, but it carried something new, something questioning, and she noticed it. I could see it in the way her posture adjusted, the way her shoulders squared just a little more. That is not fair, she repeated, but this time the words were softer, less certain, as if even she was beginning to hear how they sounded. I stepped closer to the window, my reflection faintly visible against the glass, layered over the garden beyond it, steady, unchanged. Fairness is not the issue, I said. Awareness is. Daniel shifted again, his attention moving between us, trying to follow something that no longer fit into the pattern he had grown used to. We thought you wanted help, he said, and there was a sincerity in it now. But it came too late. It came after decisions had already been made, after assumptions had already taken root. I nodded slightly, acknowledging the intention without accepting the outcome. Help does not remove a person from their own life, I said, and the words settled into the space between us, not sharp, not accusatory, just clear. Ashley crossed her arms then, a small movement, but telling, a subtle shift from control to defense. And what happens if we make a mistake? she asked, her tone careful, measured again. But no longer confident, I met her gaze steadily. Then the terms apply, I said simply, and there was no need to elaborate. No need to explain further, because the simplicity of it was what made it absolute. Daniel's expression changed then, something deeper settling in, something that had not been there before, understanding, not complete, not comfortable, but present. You planned all of this, he said quietly, not as an accusation, but as a realization. I considered the words for a moment, not to decide on an answer, but to choose how it would be understood. No, I said. I corrected what had already been set in motion. Ashley let out a small breath. Almost imperceptible, but it carried weight, the kind that comes when control is no longer something you can rely on. The room grew quiet again, but it was not the same silence as before. This one was more grounded, less uncertain, as if the shape of things had finally become visible. Even if it was not what they had expected, I turned slightly, moving toward the kitchen, not to leave the conversation, but to shift it again, to bring it into a space that had always belonged to me. The familiar arrangement of the counters, the soft hum of the appliances, the quiet steadiness of a place that had witnessed everything without changing. They followed, of course, slower this time, less certain, and when I reached the center of the room, I paused, resting my hand lightly against the back of a chair. There is one more thing, I said, and both of them looked at me immediately, the tension returning, but different now, not sharp, not aggressive, just attentive. The clause is not new, I continued. It is simply enforced now. Daniel frowned slightly, processing the words. What do you mean? He asked, and I met his gaze, steady, unwavering. I mean, I said, that the way you choose to act from this point forward is no longer something that can be overlooked. Ashley did not speak, and in that silence, I could see it clearly, the shift, the realization that whatever influence she had built, whatever control she had carefully constructed over time, was now being measured against something she could not adjust, something she could not redirect, something that did not respond to suggestion or pressure, only to action. And for the first time since she had entered this house, she did not have the final move. The air in the kitchen felt different now, not tense in the way it had been earlier, but sharpened, as if every word carried more weight than before. Ashley was the first to move again, stepping slightly to the side, repositioning herself near the counter as though proximity to something solid might restore the control she was used to holding. She placed her hand lightly against the marble surface, fingers tapping once, twice. A small rhythm that betrayed the effort it took to remain composed. So you are saying everything we do is being watched now, she said, her tone measured, but there was something beneath it, something cautious. I turned my head just enough to meet her eyes. No, I replied. I am saying everything you do matters now. The distinction settled between us, quiet but unmistakable. Daniel leaned back slightly against the doorway, his arms hanging loosely at his sides, his posture no longer defensive, no longer assertive, just uncertain, as if he were trying to find a place in a conversation that had moved beyond him. We never meant to push you out, he said, and this time the words came slower, more deliberate, as though he were choosing them carefully, hoping they might still carry enough weight to change something. I studied him for a moment, not unkindly, but without softening the truth. Intent does not erase impact, I said, and I could see the words land, not harshly, but firmly. Ashley exhaled quietly, her gaze shifting away for just a moment before returning, recalculating, always recalculating. Then what exactly do you want? She asked, and this time the question was direct, stripped of its earlier polish. I did not answer immediately, not because I did not know, but because I wanted the answer to be heard without distortion, without assumption. I let the silence settle just long enough to clear the space. I want to live in my own home without being treated like a guest, I said, my voice steady, calm. I want decisions about my life to include me, not be made around me, and I want respect that does not depend on what you think you are about to gain. The words were simple, but they did not need to be anything else. Daniel's shoulders dropped slightly, the tension easing just enough to reveal something else beneath it, something closer to understanding. That is not unreasonable, he said quietly, almost to himself. Ashley remained still, her expression controlled, But there was a shift. Subtle, almost imperceptible. The kind that happens when a situation can no longer be shaped to fit a preferred outcome. And if we do that, she said carefully, then nothing changes. I held her gaze, steady. Then nothing changes, I repeated, and the simplicity of it seemed to unsettle her more than anything else had. Because simplicity leaves no room for manipulation, no space to reinterpret. Daniel pushed himself away from the doorway then, stepping further into the kitchen, closer to the center of the room, closer to me. And if we do not? He asked, and there was no defiance in his voice now, only a need to understand the boundaries that had been drawn. Then the clause is enforced, I said, and again, there was no need to raise my voice, no need to add emphasis. The weight of the words came from their certainty, not their volume. Ashley's fingers stilled against the counter, her posture tightening just slightly. You would really do that, she said. And this time there was something else in her tone, something unfamiliar. Not control, not confidence, but doubt. I met her gaze without hesitation. I already have, I said, and the truth of it settled into the room. Quiet and undeniable, Daniel looked between us. The shift now fully visible in his expression, not confusion anymore, but recognition, the kind that comes when a situation can no longer be dismissed or simplified. We thought we had time, he said, and the words carried a weight that had not been there before. I nodded slightly, acknowledging the realization without softening it. You did, I said. You just chose not to use it. The silence that followed was different again, not heavy, not tense, but settled, as if something had finally reached its natural position. Ashley straightened, drawing in a slow breath, her composure returning, but changed. No longer built on assumption, but on awareness. We will adjust, she said, and this time the words were not a strategy, they were a decision. Daniel nodded once, a small, definitive motion, as if confirming something to himself more than to me. I turned slightly, moving toward the sink, the familiar motion grounding, ordinary, intentional. I placed my hands lightly against the edge of the counter, looking out through the window at the garden beyond. The roses steady, unchanged. Good, I said, softly, not as approval, not as relief, but as acknowledgement, because what came next would not be shaped by promises or intentions, it would be shaped by action, and for the first time in a long while, that was no longer something I had to wait for. It was something already set in motion. The house settled into a quiet rhythm that evening. Not the kind of silence that comes from avoidance, but the kind that follows after something has been clearly defined. Daniel moved more carefully now, his footsteps measured, his presence less assumed, as though he were learning the space again from the beginning. Ashley, on the other hand, did not slow down, not entirely, but there was a difference in the way she moved through the rooms, a subtle hesitation before opening drawers, a brief pause before making decisions that once would have been automatic. It was not submission, it was awareness, and awareness changes everything. I remained in the kitchen for a while longer, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to observe, to see how quickly habits shift when the rules are no longer implied but enforced. Daniel approached first, his movements quieter than usual, his hands resting lightly against the back of a chair. Do you want me to make dinner? He asked, and the question itself carried more meaning than the words. It had been a long time since he had asked, a long time since he had considered that I might not be the one responsible for maintaining the rhythm of the house. I turned slightly, meeting his eyes. If you would like to, I said, keeping my tone neutral, not encouraging, not dismissing, just allowing the choice to remain his. He nodded once, a small gesture, and moved toward the stove, his actions deliberate, careful, as if he were aware that even something as simple as preparing a meal now carried weight. Ashley watched from the other side of the room, her arms no longer crossed, her posture less rigid, but her gaze attentive, always attentive. She stepped closer after a moment, not interrupting, not directing, just observing. And that, more than anything, marked the change. She was no longer leading, she was adjusting. I moved toward the living room, my steps steady, unhurried, allowing them the space to navigate the new balance without my presence guiding it. The late afternoon light had shifted, stretching longer across the floor, softening the edges of the room. I sat in my usual chair, the one Edward had always said fit the space perfectly, and rested my hands in my lap, listening, not for conflict, but for the absence of it, the quiet exchange of words from the kitchen, the clink of utensils, the low hum of movement that no longer revolved solely around me, and yet did not exclude me either. It was different, and for the first time in a long while, different did not feel like loss. It felt like correction. Time passed slowly, not dragging, not rushed, just steady, the way it does when there is nothing left to anticipate, only to observe. Eventually, Daniel appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Dinner is ready," he said, and there was a slight uncertainty in his voice. As though he were not entirely sure how this moment would be received, I stood, smoothing my hands over my skirt, and walked toward the dining room. The table already set, not perfectly, not with the same precision I had always maintained, but thoughtfully, intentionally. Ashley stood near one of the chairs, adjusting the placement of a fork, a small movement, but one that carried a different energy than before. She glanced up as I entered, her expression composed, but no longer distant. "We kept it simple," she said, and I nodded slightly, acknowledging the effort without placing weight on it. We sat, not in silence, but not in forced conversation either, the kind of quiet that allows space rather than fills it. Daniel served the food, his movements careful, making sure each plate was placed properly, his attention no longer divided, no longer directed elsewhere. And as we ate, there were no declarations, no apologies, no attempts to redefine what had already been made clear, only small, deliberate actions, the passing of a dish, the refilling of a glass, the occasional exchange of a glance that held more meaning than words could carry. And I realized then that this was where change actually begins, not in the moment of confrontation, not in the reading of a document, but in the quiet decisions that follow, the ones that are repeated, reinforced, and eventually become something steady, something lasting. Ashley spoke once, midway through the meal, her voice measured, but no longer sharp. "We will review everything again tomorrow," she said, not as a challenge, not as a strategy, but as a statement of intent. I looked at her, steady. "That would be wise," I replied, and there was no tension in the exchange, no underlying resistance, just acknowledgement. Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful, as if he were finally seeing the full scope of what had been set in motion. And for the first time since this all began, there was no need for me to say anything more, because what needed to be understood had already been placed where it belonged, not in words, not in assumptions, but in action. And as the evening settled around us, quiet and grounded, I knew that whatever came next would not be decided in a single moment, but in many small ones, each choice building on the last, each action reinforcing what had already been made clear. And this time, I would not be watching from the edges. I would be exactly where I had always belonged, at the center of my own life. The next morning arrived without announcement, the kind of quiet transition that does not ask for attention but still carries significance. I woke earlier than usual, not out of habit, but out of awareness. The house felt different in the early light, not unfamiliar, just more defined, as if every object had settled into its proper place overnight. I moved through my morning routine without interruption. The soft sound of the coffee maker, the faint warmth of sunlight filtering through the curtains, the steady rhythm of a space that no longer felt uncertain. When I entered the kitchen, Daniel was already there, standing by the counter with a mug in his hand, his posture relaxed but not careless. He looked up as I walked in, and there was a pause, brief but noticeable, the kind that comes when someone is deciding how to begin again. "Good morning," he said, and his voice carried something it had not held in a long time. Intention. I nodded slightly. "Good morning," I replied, my tone even, unchanged. He gestured lightly toward the coffee. "I made some," he added, not as an offering, but as information, as if he were learning that actions do not need to be announced to have meaning. I poured myself a cup, the familiar motion grounding, and for a moment, we stood in silence, not uncomfortable, not forced, just present. Ashley entered a few minutes later, her steps measured, her expression composed. She paused at the doorway for just a second, taking in the scene, and I could see the calculation again, but it was different now, quieter, less dominant. She stepped inside. "We should go over everything today," she said, her voice steady, but no longer leading. I turned slightly, meeting her gaze. "We will," I said, and the simplicity of the response seemed to settle something in her. She nodded once, moving toward the table, and for the first time since she had entered this house, she did not position herself at the center. She chose a seat that allowed space, not control. We sat together, the table between us not as a barrier, but as a structure, something that held the conversation in place. Daniel brought a folder from the counter, setting it down carefully. "I reviewed the documents again," he said, his tone thoughtful. "Everything is clear." I watched him for a moment, noting the shift in the way he spoke, no longer assuming, no longer dismissing, just stating what he had come to understand. Ashley opened the folder, her movements precise, but not hurried. She turned a few pages, her eyes scanning the text, and I could see it again, that moment of recognition, not resistance, not frustration, but acceptance, the kind that comes when something cannot be reshaped, only respected. "The conditions are specific," she said quietly, more to herself than to either of us. I nodded slightly. "They were meant to be," I replied, and there was no edge in my voice, no need for emphasis, because the meaning was already clear. Daniel leaned forward, resting his forearms lightly on the table. "We will follow them," he said, and this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just a decision. Ashley glanced at him, then back at the document, and after a moment, she closed the folder, her hands resting on top of it, still, composed. "We will," she echoed, and the repetition did not feel forced. It felt aligned. I took a sip of my coffee, the warmth steady, familiar, and for a moment, there was nothing left to add, no corrections to make, no boundaries to restate, because what needed to be understood had already been absorbed, not just in words, but in the quiet recognition. Of consequence, time moved forward in small, deliberate ways after that. Daniel cleared the table without being asked, his movements efficient but not rushed. Ashley gathered the papers, organizing them carefully, not as a means of control, but as a way of maintaining order, and I remained where I was, not directing, not intervening, just present. The house no longer felt like a place where I had to defend my position. It felt like what it had always been meant to be, a space that reflected balance, not dominance. Later that afternoon, as the sunlight shifted again, casting longer shadows across the floor, I found myself standing by the window once more, looking out at the garden, the roses fully open now, their color deep and steady, unchanged by anything beyond their own growth. I thought about the past few days, the conversations, the shifts, the quiet corrections that had taken place, and I realized that the most important change had not been in the documents or the conditions. It had been in the way the space was now being held, not by assumption, not by control, but by awareness. Behind me, I heard footsteps, lighter this time, more measured. Ashley's voice followed, softer than it had ever been. "Is there anything else we should review?" she asked, and I turned slightly, meeting her gaze. There was no challenge in her eyes now, no attempt to lead, just a question, clear and direct. I considered it for a moment, not because I needed to, but because I wanted the answer to reflect exactly what was true. "No," I said. "Everything is already in place." And for the first time, there was no tension in the response, no underlying resistance, just a shared understanding. And as the quiet settled around us once more, it did not feel uncertain, it felt complete. The days that followed did not announce themselves with anything dramatic, no sudden shifts, no raised voices, no moment that demanded attention. But the change was there, steady and undeniable, woven into the smallest details of daily life. Daniel began asking questions before making decisions, simple ones at first, about schedules, about repairs, about things that once would have been handled without a second thought. And each time he asked, he waited for an answer, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. Ashley moved through the house with a different kind of precision, not the sharp, controlling kind that had once defined her presence, but something quieter, more measured. She no longer rearranged things without asking, no longer spoke over conversations that were not hers to lead. Instead, she listened, observed, and when she did speak, it was with intention rather than assumption. I did not comment on the change. I did not acknowledge it directly, because it did not need to be named to be real. It was evident in the way the house felt, in the way the air moved through it, no longer heavy with tension, no longer uncertain, but settled, balanced. One afternoon, as I sat in the living room with a book resting open in my lap, Daniel entered quietly, pausing near the doorway as if considering whether to interrupt. "I scheduled the contractor to come by next week," he said, his voice steady. "But I wanted to check with you first, to make sure it works for you." I looked up, meeting his eyes, and there was something there that had not been present before, not just respect, but awareness, the understanding that this space was not something he managed, but something he shared. "That is fine," I replied, and the exchange was simple, but it carried weight, because it was chosen, not assumed. Ashley joined us a moment later, holding a folder, the same one from earlier in the week, but now it was no longer a tool of control. It was a reference, something she used to ensure alignment rather than enforce it. "I reviewed the maintenance schedule as well," she said, her tone calm. "There are a few updates we should discuss, when you have time." I nodded slightly. "We can go over it later," I said. And again, there was no tension, no underlying resistance, just agreement. The kind that comes from clarity rather than compromise. As the days passed, I found myself noticing the absence of things I had once grown used to, the absence of being overlooked, the absence of decisions made in quiet corners without my knowledge, the absence of that subtle feeling of being out of place in my own home. And in their place, there was something else, something steadier, a rhythm that included me without needing to be forced, a presence that did not need to be asserted because it was already understood. One evening, as the sun dipped lower and the house settled into its usual quiet, Ashley approached me with a small, deliberate pause, the kind that signals intention rather than interruption. "I wanted to ask you something," she said, and I looked up from where I was sitting, meeting her gaze. There was no edge in her expression, no calculation, just a directness that felt unfamiliar in the best way. "Go ahead," I said. She hesitated briefly, not out of uncertainty, but out of care in choosing her words. "When you made that change," she said, "did you expect it to work like this?" I considered the question for a moment, not because I needed time to answer, but because I wanted the answer to reflect the truth of it. "No," I said, my voice calm. "I expected it to make things clear," she nodded, slowly, absorbing the response. "And it did," she said, and there was no resistance in her tone, no attempt to reinterpret it, just acknowledgement. Daniel, who had been standing nearby, added quietly, "We should have understood it sooner." I did not respond to that, not because it was unimportant, but because it was already understood. There was no need to revisit what had already been corrected. Instead, I stood, smoothing my hands over my skirt, and walked toward the window, the same one that had framed so many of my thoughts over the past few days. The garden beyond it was steady, unchanged, the roses fully open now, their color deep, unwavering. And as I looked out at them, I felt something settle, not relief, not triumph, but completion. Behind me, the house moved quietly, Daniel setting something down in the kitchen, Ashley organizing the papers she had brought, their movements no longer competing, no longer overlapping in ways that disrupted the balance, but aligning, naturally, without force. And in that alignment, there was something that had been missing for a long time. Not control, not authority, but respect, the kind that does not need to be demanded, because it is already understood. I remained there for a moment longer, taking in the stillness, the clarity of it. And then I turned back into the room, my steps steady, my presence no longer something that needed to be reclaimed, because it had never truly been lost, only overlooked. And now, finally, it was exactly where it belonged.